London did not gasp when the engagement was announced. London gasped when it unraveled, publicly, irreversibly, in a room full of people who would spend the rest of their lives claiming they saw it coming. But that is the nature of certain disasters. They are only inevitable in retrospect. In the moment of their unfolding, they are simply the worst thing that has ever happened in that particular room, on that particular evening, to that particular family, and the room in this case was the Haverston Ballroom, and the evening was the 14th of June, 1882, and the family was the Ashfords, and what happened in that room would be spoken of in every drawing room in Mayfair, dissected over breakfast in Belgravia, and printed, carefully, obliquely, with the elegant restraint that polite newspapers reserve for the total destruction of reputations, in the Morning Post by Thursday. What actually happened? That is the question. Not what London said happened. London, as a social organism, is a gifted novelist, and its version of events is always more coherent and more satisfying than the truth. Not what the Duke of Ashbourne later claimed happened. The Duke was a man of considerable intelligence and considerable wounded pride, and his account was shaped by both. But what actually happened in the unedited sequence of a single evening, beginning with a woman in a gown the color of deep water standing at the far end of the Haverston Ballroom, very still, very composed, watching a man she should not have been watching in a room full of people who were, in turn, watching her. Lady Evelyn Ashford, 24, the eldest daughter of Viscount Ashford. Promised, formally, publicly, irrevocably, or so everyone believed, to the Duke of Ashbourne. Standing still, watching, and the entire architecture of her arranged future standing precisely 6 feet to her left, holding 2 glasses of champagne, already beginning to understand that something had shifted. Power never shouts, it rearranges, and something had been rearranging for months. Quietly, beneath the surface of every correct answer Evelyn had given, every appropriate smile, every afternoon call and escort to dinner and hand offered at the right moment by the right man. Something had been building in the deep grammar of her silences, in the private correspondence she kept locked in a writing box, in the particular quality of her attention whenever a certain name was mentioned, in the way she stood at windows at dawn and looked at the street below as though she were calculating distances. 3 months earlier, London did not yet know any of this. 3 months earlier, the story had not yet chosen its shape. 3 months earlier, the engagement context. To understand what Evelyn Ashford had agreed to, you must first understand what she had been given no real choice but to agree to, and to understand that you must understand the world that made such agreements not merely possible but structurally necessary. England in 1882 was a country that had convinced itself it was stable precisely because the instability beneath it was so enormous and so continuous that stability had become the only narrative anyone could bear to maintain. The Industrial Revolution had been reshaping the economic order for 3 generations. The men who had built their fortunes in steel and coal and rail, men whose grandfathers had stood at machines, whose fathers had managed factories, who themselves had turned provincial enterprise into national power. These men were now in London. They were in the clubs, at the edges of the dinner tables, in the financial discussions that shaped policy. They had more money than most of the old aristocracy. They had more practical power than the old aristocracy cared to acknowledge. What they did not yet have was legitimacy, and legitimacy in the world Evelyn Ashford had been born into was not purchased, it was inherited. It moved through bloodlines and title deeds and the ancient invisible architecture of who your people were and how long they had mattered, and it could, in certain carefully negotiated circumstances, be extended. Through marriage, through alliance, through the transfer of an old name to a new fortune, or a new fortune to an old name, in arrangements that everyone understood were commercial and everyone agreed to describe as romantic. The Ashford fortune had been diminishing for 15 years, not catastrophically, not yet. But with the gradual, relentless pressure of a family that had maintained expensive appearances through a combination of pride and credit, and whose credit, by the spring of 1882, was considerably more extended than their pride permitted them to acknowledge openly. The London house, the Yorkshire estate, the staff, the horses, the charitable subscriptions, the season, all of it continued, because to stop any of it was to announce to the world that the Ashfords were failing. And in their world, the announcement of failure was a species of failure far more lethal than the original condition. Evelyn understood this. She had understood it for years with the particular lucidity of a woman who has been educated just enough to see clearly and not quite enough, in the world's estimation, for her clarity to count for anything. Her father had told her on a Tuesday morning in March. He had stood near the window. He had not been able to look directly at her. He had explained, quietly, carefully, with the pained precision of a man who knew what he was doing and knew he could not stop himself from doing it, that an arrangement had been made with the Duke of Ashbourne's household, that the terms were favorable, that the Duke was a man of significant property and significant standing, and that the marriage would secure the Ashford name and the Ashford estate for the next generation and the generation after that. He had said, "I would not ask this of you if there were another way." Evelyn had looked at her father for a long moment. She had been 24 years old. She had read more history than most men her age had been required to read. She understood primogeniture and the legal architecture that made her father's estate the property of a distant male cousin upon his death, rather than the property of the daughters who had grown up in it. She understood reputation as currency and how quickly it devalued in the wrong circumstances. She understood that what her father was telling her was not a request but a decision that had already been made, wrapped in the language of a request because he loved her, and because calling it what it was would have required him to look at himself in a way he was not capable of sustaining. She had asked one question: "Is there a choice?" He had been quiet. "There is always a choice," he said. "But some choices have consequences that extend far beyond the person making them." She had nodded. She had gone upstairs. She had not cried. She had done the calculation that women of her century were required to make, measuring the weight of her own future against the weight of every person whose survival depended on her compliance, and she had agreed. But agreement is not surrender, and surrender is not silence. The Duke of Ashbourne arrived at the Ashford house on Thursdays. He arrived at 3 o'clock precisely because precision was a form of control that he exercised over his entire existence, and the arrivals of social calls were no exception. He was 42 years old. He had inherited one of the oldest titles in England along with 40,000 acres in 3 counties, a principal residence in Wiltshire requiring 60 staff simply to maintain, and a reputation for being a man of absolute reliability, which in aristocratic circles was considered the highest conceivable compliment, and which Evelyn, after 4 Thursday afternoon calls, had begun to understand was simply another way of describing a man who had never once been compelled to imagine the interior life of another person. He was not a cruel man. This is important, and it is also complicated, because the harm that the Duke of Ashbourne represented to Evelyn Ashford was not the simple harm of cruelty. It was the deeper, less dramatic harm of absolute certainty. He was certain of his own correctness, certain of the structure that had produced him and that he intended to perpetuate. Certain that Evelyn, who was intelligent and composed and well-bred, would make an excellent duchess, which was to say she would manage his households, represent his family and society with appropriate grace, and provide the heirs that the continuation of the Ashbourne line required. He had not once, in 4 Thursday afternoon calls, asked her what she thought. Not about anything. He spoke well. He spoke about the estate, about Parliament, about the management of the Ashbourne properties, about the social calendar, about the arrangements for the engagement announcement. He asked her questions that were invitations to agree. The Haverston Ball seems the appropriate venue, don't you think? and he received her agreements with the comfortable satisfaction of a man whose expectations are consistently met. Evelyn sat across from him and said the appropriate things and smiled at the appropriate moments, and understood with increasing and unwelcome clarity that she was not present in these conversations in any meaningful sense. She was a future asset being assessed for quality. In societies like this, silence is architecture. The silence of women was not incidental to the Victorian social order. It was structural. It was load-bearing. The entire system of inheritance, reputation, and aristocratic continuity rested on the assumption that women would move through their prescribed roles without insisting on the inconvenience of interior lives. A woman who spoke her mind was eccentric. A woman who acted on it was dangerous. A woman who chose, genuinely from her own judgment, without the validation of male authority, was a social problem that required immediate containment. Evelyn had spent 24 years learning to be impeccably silent. She was very good at it. And she was beginning in the spring of 1882 to understand that she could not sustain it much longer. She met Adrian Whitmore at Lady Pemberton's dinner in the third week of April. She had not expected to find him interesting. She had expected him to be what he appeared to be at first assessment, an industrialist's son at a society dinner, present by virtue of someone else's strategic calculation, performing his own respectability with the slightly excessive effort of someone who knows he is being evaluated. She had seen dozens of men like this navigating the fringes of aristocratic London, and she had found none of them particularly remarkable. Adrian Whitmore was not performing his respectability. That was the first thing she noticed. Most men in his position, 34 years old, son of a Yorkshire manufacturer, self-made in the specific sense that he had taken his father's regional fortune and built it into something genuinely national, would have arrived at Lady Pemberton's dinner with a kind of social hunger, a visible desire to be approved of. Whitmore had arrived with the particular calm of someone who has assessed the room and found it neither threatening nor impressive, not arrogant, something more unsettling than arrogance, indifference to the social hierarchy's verdict. He had been seated 3 places from Evelyn, and the dinner conversation had been the usual carefully managed pleasantness, the season, the weather, someone's ill-judged hat at Ascot, until Lord Pemberton had made an offhand remark about the railway consolidation proposals before Parliament. A throwaway comment requiring no real engagement, simply a murmur of polite agreement and a pivot to something less contentious. Whitmore had said with complete composure and no apparent awareness of the effect it would produce that the proposal as currently structured would eliminate the competitive pressures that had originally driven railway efficiency, and that the beneficiaries of the bill were not the traveling public, as its proponents claimed, but the 3 largest holding companies who had quietly drafted the legislation through their parliamentary proxies. The table had gone silent. Not the polite pause of social discomfort, the specific, alert silence of a room in which someone has said something true in the presence of people who depend on the untruth being maintained. Lord Pemberton had recovered. The conversation had moved on. But Evelyn had looked down the table at Adrian Whitmore and seen something she had not expected to find at Lady Pemberton's dinner. A man who had said a true thing in a room that preferred comfortable falsehoods, and who had said it not for effect, not to impress, but simply because it was true and because he apparently operated from the assumption that truth was worth saying. She had said nothing at dinner. She had been practiced for years in saying nothing. But she had noticed him with the particular quality of noticing that announces itself as something other than mere social observation. It was in the corridor afterward, the shuffle between dining room and drawing room, that she paused, and that he paused also, and that the distance between them produced a conversation. "You disagree with something I said," he told her. She had been startled by the directness of it. Not the observation, which was accurate, but the fact that he had addressed her as someone whose disagreement was worth investigating. "Not with the conclusion," she said carefully, "with the framing. You described the bill as a corruption of competitive principle, but competitive principle was never the point. Capital accumulation was always the point. The efficiency was incidental, a consequence of competition, not its purpose. If the goal was always capital, then the bill is internally consistent, even if the public justification is a fiction. He had looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. "Who are you?" he said. Not rhetorically, as an actual inquiry. "Evelyn Ashford," she said. "I know the name," he said. "I meant, who are you?" She had no answer for that. Or rather, she had an answer, but it was not one she had ever been given permission to speak aloud. She deflected. They parted. The drawing room received her back, and she performed the remainder of the evening with her usual precision. But in the carriage home, she turned the question over and over in the privacy of her own mind, with the unsettling recognition of someone who has been asked a question they have been avoiding for years. "Who are you?" She had been trained her entire life to be an answer to other people's questions. A daughter, a future wife, a social asset. A name that would be transferred legally and publicly into the property of another name. She had been trained to occupy this role with grace and composure and intelligent silence, and she had done it superbly, and she had never once been asked, not by anyone who mattered, not in any context that permitted a real answer, what she herself actually was. If you were in that corridor hearing that question for the first time, what would your answer have been? Growing shift. April became May. They saw each other perhaps 8 times across 6 weeks, never alone, never in any context that could be called improper, always at the edges of the social gatherings that London's season produced in its relentless, overlapping abundance. Each encounter was brief. Each conversation was careful, conducted in the coded language that both of them understood was necessary, because there were ears everywhere and some conversations were not safe to have in full voice. But the conversations were extraordinary, not because of romantic intensity. It was not that, not yet, not in any way that Evelyn would have permitted herself to name. It was something more fundamental and in certain ways more dangerous. Adrian Whitmore thought differently from any man she had ever spoken with. Not simply more directly, though he was direct. Not simply more intelligently, though he was intelligent. He thought from a different set of premises, from the ground up without the inherited assumptions that shaped the thinking of every man in her world. The aristocratic mind she had observed over 24 years operated largely within a closed system. It assumed the legitimacy of the existing order, worked within its logic, and measured all questions against its standards. Adrian Whitmore did not accept the existing order as a given. He examined it. He asked what it was for, who it served, what it cost to maintain, and whether its costs were justified. These were not safe questions. They were the most interesting questions she had ever been invited to consider. At a musical in Cavendish Square, he had said in passing that the principle of primogeniture was economically irrational, not immoral. He was careful not to use the language of morality, which was inflammatory, but simply inefficient as a mechanism for managing inherited assets, since it concentrated decision-making in a single heir regardless of capacity and distributed family interest in ways that generated conflict rather than coordination. Evelyn had said equally carefully that the economic analysis was correct but missed the social function, that primogeniture was not designed to optimize asset management but to prevent the fragmentation of political power, and that its irrationality as an economic instrument was precisely its value as a political one. He had looked at her with that unclassifiable expression. "You understand the system better than almost anyone inside it," he said. "Understanding a system," she said, "is not the same as approving of it." "No," he said, "but it's the prerequisite for changing it." She had looked at him then, really looked at him, across the careful social distance of the musicale's anteroom, and felt something shift in the internal architecture of her certainty about what her life was going to be. Choice in that century was a weapon, not a gift, not a right. A weapon that the powerful possessed and the powerless were denied, and the most effective way to deny it was not force but the patient, multi-generational work of constructing a world in which certain people could not imagine having choices, in which the absence of choice felt natural, inevitable, even moral. Evelyn had been educated in every subtle and not subtle way available to her world not to imagine having choices. She was beginning, for the first time, to imagine, and the man who had made that imagination possible was not simply an alternative romantic prospect. He was something far more structurally disruptive than that. He was evidence, living, articulate, undeniable evidence, that the premises on which her entire existence had been constructed were not facts but decisions, not nature but architecture, and architecture, unlike nature, can be rebuilt. This was what made Adrian Whitmore dangerous, not his feelings for her, which were real but which were private and containable, his ideas. His ideas were structural dynamite in a world built from carefully maintained fictions, and Evelyn Ashford, in the privacy of her own mind, was beginning to understand what it would mean to light the fuse. The first letter arrived on a Wednesday morning in mid-May among the usual correspondence. She almost did not read it. The envelope bore no crest, no marking, simply her name in a hand she did not recognize. She opened it with the efficient disinterest of someone accustomed to social correspondence. 4 lines. Miss Ashford, I find that I cannot not write this, which should tell you something about the degree to which you have disrupted my normally reliable capacity for rational restraint. There is something I would say to you, if your circumstances permitted it. They do not, and I am aware of that. Awareness, I have discovered, is inadequate. A W. She read it 3 times. She sat very still, and then she placed it in the writing box in her dressing room and went downstairs and ate breakfast and spoke to her mother about the arrangements for the Haverston ball and said nothing to anyone about anything. But that afternoon at her writing desk, door closed. Mr. Whitmore, the circumstances you reference were not designed by their current inhabitants. This seems worth naming even when it cannot be acted upon. I am aware also of what awareness fails to prevent. Your disruption, for what it is worth, is entirely mutual. E.A. She sealed it. She addressed it to his club. She sent it with the Morning Post. 6 letters followed across 3 weeks, each one careful, each one technically deniable, each one containing exactly enough to make the next one possible. The 6th letter was not careful. She had written it late at night, alone in the house, in the specific quiet of a woman temporarily freed from the performance of her own composure. She had written about what it meant to understand your own imprisonment clearly enough to describe it in precise detail while remaining inside it. She had written about the Duke's Thursday calls and the particular quality of being spoken at by a man who had decided what you were before you entered the room. She had written, I have spent 24 years becoming excellent at a role I did not choose, and the excellence itself has become a kind of trap, because to perform a role perfectly is to make it invisible, to make the performance look like nature. And what I fear most is not what will happen if I refuse, but whether I am still capable of refusing, whether the conditioning has gone deep enough that the woman who would refuse has simply ceased to exist. She sealed it. She sent it. She felt, with a clarity that was almost physical, the sensation of a door opening somewhere in the structure of her carefully managed existence. His reply arrived in 48 hours. You are still there? I have met her in every conversation we have had. She is the most formidable person in any room she occupies. The conditioning has not reached her, but I think she has been waiting, with considerable and entirely justified patience, for someone to confirm that she is real. The Duke of Ashbourne was not a man who overlooked things. He had built his adult life on the principle that information, carefully collected and strategically deployed, was the most reliable instrument of power available to a man of his position. He maintained the most extensive network of social intelligence in his circle, not through anything as vulgar as hired agents, but through the natural cultivation of relationships that produced reliable information as a byproduct of loyalty, his solicitors, his club secretary, the particular set of women in his social circle who understood that their proximity to the Duke's goodwill depended on the quality of their observations. He had noticed Adrian Whitmore, not immediately, not with the sharp attention of alarm, but with the steady peripheral interest of a man cataloging potential complications. Whitmore had been at Lady Pemberton's dinner and had said the uncomfortable true thing about the railways. He had appeared at the Hargreaves musicale. He had appeared at 3 further events where Evelyn Ashford had also been present. The Duke had noted this with the calm arithmetic of a man for whom coincidence was always the least interesting explanation. He had made inquiries. The picture that assembled itself from the inquiries was not individually alarming. Whitmore was not a man of scandal. He was not financially precarious. He had not, as far as anyone could confirm, done anything specific or actionable. But the picture had a texture to it, the texture of a man who moved with too much intellectual confidence for someone in his social position, who asked questions that implied the right to question, who occupied rooms as though he belonged in them without having been made to feel that he did. The Duke distrusted men like this on principle. And there was something else, something he could not fully articulate and would not have permitted himself to articulate even if he could, because articulating it would have required him to acknowledge a vulnerability he found intolerable. Evelyn was different somehow in the weeks since the season had begun, not in any way he could point to as evidence. She remained impeccably correct. She said the right things, smiled at the right moments, received his Thursday calls with the composed courtesy that he had decided, when he chose her, would make her an excellent duchess. But she had stopped being absent. That was the only way he could formulate it to himself, and even that formulation was too uncomfortable to examine directly. She had always been present in a room in the physical sense, but there had been about her in their early acquaintance a quality of internal absence, as though the person in the room were a very well-trained representative of Evelyn Ashford rather than Evelyn Ashford herself. He had not found this troubling. He had found it appropriate. A duchess was not required to be fully present. She was required to be perfectly adequate. Recently, she had been present, watching, thinking, measuring. He had noticed this the way you notice a change in the temperature of a room without immediately knowing what has changed. And he had begun quietly and systematically the process that men of his position always began when the architecture of their arrangements showed the first signs of instability. He had begun to tighten. It happened at Lady Cavendish's political salon on the 2nd of June, a salon confrontation. Lady Cavendish hosted these gatherings monthly, evenings where the mixture of old money and new ambition was managed with particular care, where the conversation was permitted to move beyond the usual social pleasantness into something that at least gestured toward the actual business of power. Members of Parliament, financiers, industrialists, the occasional well-connected journalist, all orbiting the titled families who remained for the time being the axis around which London's social and political world still rotated. Both the Duke and Adrian Whitmore were present. This was not entirely accidental. The Duke had heard that Whitmore would attend and had, with characteristic strategic deliberateness, ensured that he would be there also, not to confront, not yet, but to observe the interaction between Whitmore and his intended, to gather the information that his peripheral monitoring had not yet yielded in sufficient precision. The salon's conversation had turned, as it often did, to the question that dominated everything in 1882, the relationship between industrial capital and political power, whether the old aristocratic system could survive in any meaningful form, whether the House of Lords retained legitimate authority over a parliament increasingly shaped by industrial and commercial interests, whether England was witnessing a transition of power or simply a renegotiation of terms. The Duke had offered with measured authority the position that stability was itself a moral value, that the accumulated wisdom of institutional tradition outweighed the enthusiasm of reformist energy, and that the mechanisms of inheritance and aristocratic governance, whatever their imperfections, represented a form of continuity that any responsible analysis of history would recognize as essential. It was a good argument. It was the argument of a man who believed it sincerely, and believed it not from laziness or selfishness, but from a genuine conviction that the world he had inherited was the best available world, and that protecting it was a form of stewardship. Adrian Whitmore from across the room said, "The question is whether the continuity being preserved is the continuity of the system's values or simply the continuity of its beneficiaries." The room adjusted. The Duke said with perfect equanimity, "In a functioning society, the two are generally the same." "In a functioning society," Whitmore said, They might be. But when the beneficiaries of a system are also its judges, the question of whether the system functions cannot be answered by the system itself. It requires outside assessment. And you propose yourself as the outside assessor? No, Whitmore said. I propose history, which has consistently shown that systems which cannot self-reform are reformed by force. The question is whether the current order intends to be the former or the latter. The room was very quiet, not the quiet of discomfort, the specific charged quiet of people witnessing something that has shifted from debate into something more personal, more structural, more dangerous. Evelyn, standing to the side of the room, had not spoken. She had been watching both men with the particular quality of attention she had been exercising for months, reading the Duke's controlled surface for the temperature beneath it, reading Whitmore's precision for the things he was choosing not to say. She understood what was happening in this exchange more clearly than anyone else in the room. This was not a political debate. This was a declaration. Whitmore was not simply arguing for reform. He was arguing in public and in front of the Duke that the order the Duke represented was not merely flawed, but structurally illegitimate, that its authority rested not on wisdom or merit, but on self-perpetuating power, and that its collapse was not a catastrophe to be avoided, but a reckoning to be prepared for. He was saying this, she understood, because he believed it. But he was saying it here, tonight, in the Duke's presence, because he understood that the time for a coded conversation in corridors was over. She felt, with a force that was almost physical, the floor of her carefully maintained equilibrium shift beneath her. The Duke had looked at Whitmore for a long moment with the expression of a man who has identified a threat and is deciding not how to respond, but when. And then he had looked at Evelyn. She had met his gaze with complete composure, but she had not, in the fraction of a second before composure arrived, been completely composed. And the Duke, who noticed things, had seen it. By the following morning, the Whisper Network had begun its work. Georgiana Hartwell had been at the salon. She had observed everything with the cataloging precision of someone who understood that the most valuable information was always the information that other people had not yet decided was important. She had watched the exchange between the Duke and Whitmore. She had watched Evelyn's face during it. She had drawn her conclusions with the calm efficiency of someone who had been drawing social conclusions for 20 years and had learned to trust her arithmetic. By 11 o'clock on the morning of the 3rd of June, 3 women in 3 separate drawing rooms had heard from Georgiana Hartwell, in 3 slightly different versions, each one fractionally more specific than the last, that there had been something at Lady Cavendish's salon. That Ashbourne's intended had been present when a certain Mr. Whitmore had rather directly challenged the Duke's position. That Evelyn had been observed during the exchange in a way that was, perhaps, worth noting. Perhaps worth noting. That was the precise currency of Georgiana Hartwell's social economy, not accusation, not confirmation, simply the careful redistribution of observation into the social bloodstream where it would circulate and accumulate and combine with other observations until the resulting compound was something nobody could be individually blamed for producing. Scandal fades, structural shifts spread. By Thursday, when the Duke arrived at the Ashford house for his weekly call, 3 women who regularly called on Evelyn's mother had introduced, in separate conversations, the topic of Mr. Whitmore, each one in a perfectly innocent context, each one watching for the reaction that would confirm or deny the thing they were not quite accusing. The Duke sat in the Ashford drawing room and spoke pleasantly about the Haverston ball, now 11 days away, about the engagement announcement, about the arrangements, and then he said, "I thought the discussion at Lady Cavendish's was interesting, did you not? Mr. Whitmore made some rather pointed arguments." Evelyn said, "He argues from economic premises. Whether one agrees with the conclusions depends rather on whether one accepts the premises." "And do you?" the Duke said. "Accept the premises?" she said. "I think they are worth examining." A silence. "Worth examining," the Duke repeated. Not with inflection, not with accusation, simply repeating the phrase back to her with the precise neutrality of a man filing it for future reference. "As an intellectual exercise," she said. "Of course," he said. And the conversation moved on, and nothing had been said that could be pointed to, and both of them understood, with the complete mutual clarity of two very intelligent people who have finally allowed each other to see what the other knows, that the conversation that had just occurred was not about intellectual premises at all. The private confrontation happened 3 days later at the Ashford house in the late afternoon. It had been technically a social call. The Duke had written that morning to say he would arrive at 4. He had arrived at 4 precisely. Evelyn had been in the drawing room. Her mother had been present for the first 20 minutes and had then, at the Duke's gentle suggestion, found an errand elsewhere. They were alone. He spoke initially about nothing of consequence, the preparations for the Haverston ball, a letter from his estate manager, the weather. And then he stopped, set down his teacup with the deliberate precision of someone marking a transition, and looked at her. "I want to speak plainly," he said. She waited. "I am not a man given to scenes," he said. "I have neither the temperament nor the inclination for emotional confrontation, but I am also not a man who permits uncertainty to persist in matters that concern his name and his house. So I will say this once, directly, and I would prefer that you hear it in that spirit." He paused. "You are about to become the Duchess of Ashbourne. That transition carries obligations that extend considerably beyond the personal. My family's name is one of the oldest in England. My estates employ 400 people. My position in Parliament affects policy that shapes this country's governance. The woman who stands beside me in public, who appears at my side at every function of consequence, who will raise my children and manage my household, that woman's conduct is not a private matter. It is institutional. It is structural. Every conversation she has, every letter she sends, every moment in which her attention is directed where it ought not to be directed, all of this reflects immediately and materially on the Ashbourne name." Evelyn said nothing. "I am telling you this," the Duke continued, "not as a threat and not as an accusation. I am telling you this because I believe you are an intelligent woman who deserves to understand precisely what she has agreed to and precisely what the consequences are of failing to honor that agreement." A silence. "Do you understand me?" he said. "Entirely," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something passed across his expression, not quite uncertainty, not quite satisfaction, something in between. "Good," he said. "Then I do not expect to return to this subject." He picked up his teacup. The conversation resumed its pleasant surface. But Evelyn, sitting across from the Duke of Ashbourne in her father's drawing room with her hands folded correctly in her lap, and her expression composed and her voice when she next spoke entirely steady, was no longer the woman who had entered the room. She had been told with perfect clarity and complete sincerity exactly what she was. She was institutional, she was structural, she was instrumental. She was not a person in this man's account of his life. She was a mechanism for the continuation of his name. She had known this, intellectually, for months. She had understood it the way you understand things that you have studied from a careful distance. But hearing it spoken aloud, in the precise and unashamed language of a man who had never once considered that she might receive it differently from how he intended it, hearing it stated as though it were simply the nature of things, as unchangeable as weather, as impersonal as gravity, something in her that had been asking questions had in that moment received its answer. Choice in that century was a weapon, and she had just been told with unmistakable precision that it was not hers. She had one thought, clear and cold and startling in its simplicity: "Then I will take it." The Duke did not return to the subject, as he had said he would not. He was a man who kept his word, but he moved, quietly, systematically, in the way that powerful men move when they have identified a variable that requires elimination. Within 4 days of the drawing-room conversation, Adrian Whitmore's proposed partnership with Sir Edmund Hargreaves, a significant industrial contract that had been in late negotiation, had stalled. The specific nature of the delay was unclear, Hargreaves had mentioned, apologetically and without detail, that certain financial considerations required further review. Whitmore's solicitors had found no specific objection they could address. The conversation had simply gone cold in the way that conversations go cold when someone has quietly suggested to someone else that proceeding might be inadvisable. Within 6 days, Whitmore had received 2 separate social withdrawals, invitations rescinded, one for a dinner at which several prospective investors would have been present, one for a private viewing at the Royal Academy that connected him to a circle he had been carefully cultivating for months. The withdrawals arrived with the correct and meaningless excuses that social withdrawals always carry. No reason that could be challenged, no door that had been visibly closed, simply a sudden cooling of the temperature around him, in the way that the social world communicates its verdicts without ever committing them to writing. He understood what was happening. He wrote to Evelyn, the 7th letter, the most careful of all, carrying no sentiment and no argument, only information. The campaign has begun. I want you to know this, not to alarm you, but because you deserve to understand what is happening and to make your own assessment of it. The pressure will increase. The intention is not simply to disadvantage me. I am frankly capable of managing the commercial consequences. The intention is to demonstrate to you concretely and unmistakably the cost of the alternative. I am telling you this so that the demonstration does not take you by surprise, and so that whatever decision you make in the next 2 weeks, information rather than in response to managed pressure, whatever you decide, it must be yours. She read the letter twice. Whatever you decide, it must be yours. She sat at her writing desk for a long time and did not write back, and thought about what it meant to make a decision that was genuinely, irrevocably, entirely one's own, in a world that had been constructed at every level to ensure that such decisions were impossible. The night of the Haverston Ball, the chandeliers burned 300 candles. The orchestra from Vienna played. 300 people in the finest clothes London could produce moved through the rooms of Haverston House with the practiced ease of people who had been performing this particular theater all their lives. Evelyn Ashford arrived on the Duke's arm at 8:30. She was perfectly dressed, perfectly composed. She said the right things and smiled at the right moments and moved through the room in the way she had been trained to move, and no one watching her in those first 2 hours would have seen anything other than a composed, well-bred young woman at the height of her social performance. But she had made her decision. She had made it 3 days before the ball, in the quiet of her room at dawn, standing at the window watching the street below in the particular not quite darkness that had become, in her private geography, the time of clearest thinking. She had made it not in a moment of passion, not in a surge of romantic feeling, but with the cold, exact clarity of a woman who has finally looked directly at the full cost of 2 different paths and chosen the one that at least is hers to choose. She had written to her father first. She had written to the Duke second, a formal letter, correct and precise, which would reach him the following morning. She had written nothing to Adrian Whitmore. What she was doing for herself, not for him, not in pursuit of him, in pursuit of something that she was not yet able to fully name, but that she understood, with complete certainty, was more essential to her survival than anything the Ashbourne alliance could offer. At the ball, she had not sought Whitmore out. He had appeared at some point in the second hour at the edge of the East Corridor, brought, she suspected, by a business connection who had not yet received the Duke's message about the inadvisability of proximity. He was not looking at her. He was speaking with quiet attention to the man beside him, and he was doing what he always did in rooms like this, occupying it without performing it, present on his own terms. She had looked at him for 2 seconds. He had looked up, and then she had looked away and turned to the Duke beside her and said, "Your Grace, I need to speak with you." He had looked at her with that particular quality of attention that indicated he understood something significant was occurring. "Now?" he said. "Yes," she said, privately, before the announcement. They had moved to the library. The door had closed, and what was said between them in the next 9 minutes was never subsequently fully confirmed by either party, but it was sufficient. When they returned to the ballroom, something had changed in the architecture of the space between them, visible to anyone who looked carefully, which was to say visible to everyone, because everyone at this sort of gathering was always looking carefully. The announcement, when it came, was not the announcement that had been planned. Lord Haverston called the room to attention. The Duke stepped forward. The room arranged itself into the expected posture of reception, and the Duke said, with perfect composure, with the controlled dignity of a man who has decided that the appearance of choice is preferable to the appearance of defeat, that there would be a delay in the announcement that had been anticipated this evening due to matters requiring further consideration between the families. The room received this in silence. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds, and then it began. The sound of 300 people simultaneously recalibrating, a social adjustment so immediate and so complete that it was audible as a shift in the room's atmosphere before it became audible as sound. The murmur, the turn of heads, the rapid triangulation between the Duke's face, Evelyn's face, and the man standing near the east corridor who should not have been at this ball at all. Embarrassment in powerful men rarely dies quietly. The Duke had known this when he said what he said. He had calculated, correctly, that a controlled partial withdrawal was survivable in a way that a public rupture was not. He had preserved the form of dignity by sacrificing the substance of the announcement. He had bought time, but the room had already drawn its conclusions. The whisper network had already received its raw material. By the time the orchestra resumed and the champagne was poured and the evening continued in its correct and terrible way, the story was already assembling itself in the minds of 300 people, each one adding their detail, their observation, their carefully filed memory of a glance across a room at a salon, a conversation in a corridor, a letter addressed to a club, a woman who had been slightly too still at precisely the wrong moment. Evelyn stood in the center of the room. She was perfectly composed, but she had lit the fuse, and she knew it, and she was not, she discovered, with a clarity that was equal parts terror and something she could not quite call relief, but that was in the same territory. She was not sorry. She was home by midnight. The house was quiet. Her father was awake, waiting in the study, which meant the Duke's communication had reached him faster than she had anticipated, or someone at the ball had sent word. She went in. They spoke for 30 minutes. Her father was not angry. He was frightened, which was worse. He did not shout. He sat at his desk with the expression of a man watching the structure that has supported his entire life, developing cracks from the foundation outward, and he said quietly that he hoped she understood what this meant for the family. She said that she did. She said that she was sorry for the cost to him. She meant it. She said that she could not continue. She meant that too. She went upstairs. She sat in her room. She did not sleep. She thought about what came next, not romantically, not with any particular sense of liberation, because the world through which she would now have to move was not going to become easier, and she was not naive enough to imagine it would. She thought about it practically with the same cold clarity she brought to everything. The Ashford family's financial position would worsen. The Duke would not be openly vindictive. He was too controlled for that, too conscious of appearances. But the quiet withdrawal of his goodwill from the social networks that touched the Ashford name would be felt. The Ashford title would survive. The Ashford estate would not survive in its current form. Her sister's prospects would be affected. Her own position in society would be materially altered. She knew all of this. She also knew that she had written 6 letters to a man who understood the architecture of the world as well as the Duke did, and who had considerably less investment in its continuation. She knew that the ideas she had spent 3 months thinking, the arguments about primogeniture and institutional legitimacy and the manufactured consent of women inside systems they had not chosen, were no longer abstract. They were the premises of her life. And she knew one more thing. In the morning, a letter would arrive at Whitmore's lodgings near Fitzroy Square. She had written it before the ball, sealed and sent 2 days prior, time to arrive after the announcement or its dissolution, depending on how the evening resolved. It contained 3 sentences. I have made my decision. It was mine to make. I do not require rescue, but if you are still interested in the conversation we have been having for 3 months, I believe it has only just genuinely begun." He would write back. She was certain of this. What would happen after that, in the drawing rooms of Mayfair, in the financial offices where his contracts were quietly being undermined, in the parliamentary circles where the Duke moved with the patient, structural authority of a man who understood that real power never announces itself, she could not fully predict. But something was certain. Scandal fades, structural shifts spread. The Duke had called her institutional. He had called her structural. He had meant it as a description of her obligation. He had not anticipated that she would use it as a description of her strategy. He had not anticipated that a woman who understood the system this clearly might be capable, not of escaping it. Escape was always theatrical, and Evelyn was never theatrical, but of operating within it differently, of applying the same careful, patient, structural thinking to the business of her own existence that she had spent 24 years applying to the performance of her expected role. He had not anticipated, in short, that intelligence, genuinely applied, fully expressed, no longer contained by the discipline of compliance, was a different kind of power from the one he was accustomed to managing. He would learn. They all would. In societies like this, silence is architecture, but architecture can be redesigned. And Evelyn Ashford, standing at her window in the gray London dawn, watching the street below come slowly into focus, was done being silent. The Haverston ball was over. The announcement had not been made. London had drawn its conclusions and had begun the patient, relentless work of converting those conclusions into social consequence. The Whisper Network was operating at full efficiency. 3 drawing rooms had already received Georgiana Hartwell's most refined version of events. 2 newspapers had received, from unnamed but reliable sources, the suggestion that a story worth monitoring was developing in Mayfair. The Duke of Ashbourne had returned to his house in Grosvenor Square and had sat in his study for 2 hours, in the specific quality of silence that belongs to men who have just discovered that the world has not behaved as the world was supposed to behave. He was not devastated. He was not broken. He was strategically recalibrating, assembling the instruments of retaliation with the methodical precision of a man who has 41 years' experience of being the most powerful person in any room he occupies. By morning, the first of those instruments would be in motion. Adrian Whitmore's largest pending contract, not the Hargreaves partnership, but a separate arrangement with a northern manufacturing consortium representing 18 months of negotiation and a significant portion of his projected capital for the following year, was about to encounter an obstacle: a parliamentary committee, a question of regulatory compliance that would require review, the kind of obstacle that could not be proven to have been placed deliberately, but that would cost time and money and the goodwill of partners who could not afford to be associated with complications. By the end of the week, Evelyn's younger sister would receive a withdrawal from a prospective suitor, polite, unexplained, unmistakable in its timing. By the following week, the Viscount Ashford would receive a communication from his principal creditor, a firm whose board included 2 men with long-standing ties to the Ashbourne estate, suggesting that the terms of a significant outstanding obligation required renegotiation. None of this would be visible, none of it would be provable, all of it would be felt. Embarrassment in powerful men rarely dies quietly, and Evelyn Ashford, who understood this better than anyone, who had understood it before she made her decision and had made it anyway, was already thinking about what came next, not with fear, with the particular focused intelligence of someone who has finally, after 24 years of applying her capabilities to the service of a system that did not deserve them, decided to apply them to something else entirely. London thought the story was over. London was wrong. The story was not over. The story had not yet genuinely begun. If you find yourself needing to know what comes next, what happens when the most powerful man in her world decides to make her the lesson, and when a woman who was taught to be silent decides to be heard, then you already know what to do. This is only episode 1. In episode 2, The Price of Being Seen. Adrian Whitmore's contracts will be systematically dismantled. The Duke's retaliation will move from whisper to consequence. Evelyn will discover that breaking an engagement is only the beginning, that the real machinery of aristocratic punishment operates not through scandal but through the quiet, surgical withdrawal of everything a family needs to survive. She will be forced to choose not once but repeatedly, at increasing cost, between the version of herself she was made to be and the one she is becoming. And somewhere in that sequence of impossible choices, something that began as intellectual recognition between two people will become something neither of them can walk away from, and both of them must. The engagement ended. Now comes the reckoning.